Passengers insult a fallen hero, but Barron Trump's response leaves them speechless. It was an unusually quiet morning at the bustling airport. The sunlight streamed through the tall glass windows, casting golden reflections on the polished floor. Travelers hurried past, clutching their boarding passes and dragging suitcases of all shapes and sizes. Among them was Barron Trump, dressed casually in a simple hoodie and jeans, blending in as much as his towering height would allow. He preferred traveling this way, understated and unnoticed. Barron had just returned from a philanthropic event with his mother, Melania, and was now headed to a private destination for some much-needed time away from the public eye. Airports, for all their chaos, offered him a unique solace, the anonymity of being just another passenger among many. As he waited in the gate area, scrolling absent-mindedly on his phone, a voice crackled over the loudspeaker. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the brief delay in boarding. We will be allowing the military to board first as they accompany the remains of a fallen soldier onto this flight. Your patience and understanding are greatly appreciated." The announcement was delivered with the somber respect such a moment deserved. For many, it was a humbling reminder of the sacrifices made by those in uniform. A few passengers stood a little straighter, while others whispered words of appreciation or glanced around to see if any military personnel were present. But not everyone responded with respect. From a corner of the waiting area, a group of passengers broke the silence with muttered complaints. Their voices weren't particularly loud, but in the otherwise quiet terminal, their words carried easily. "Seriously? Delayed because of some coffin?" One man grumbled, his tone dripping with irritation. "This is ridiculous," added a woman seated next to him. "Why can't they do this after we board?" "It's not like it matters to the person in the coffin." The comments spread like a ripple in a still pond, drawing the attention of nearby travelers. Some exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing, unsure of how to respond. A young mother pulled her child closer, clearly uncomfortable. An older gentleman wearing a veteran's cap visibly bristled but remained seated, gripping his armrests tightly. Barron had been seated a few rows away, partially hidden behind a column. At first he thought he had misheard, but as the complaints continued, his heart sank. "Why do we always have to stop everything for this stuff?" Another voice chimed in. "It's not like they're the only ones who work hard. I have a job too, you know." The casual disrespect struck Barron like a slap. His upbringing had instilled in him a deep respect for the military and their sacrifices. His father, as controversial as he might be, had always emphasized the importance of honoring service members. But this wasn't just about family values. This was about humanity and decency. He glanced around the terminal. Most people avoided making eye contact with the disgruntled group, choosing instead to stare at their phones or focus on their luggage. Some looked visibly uncomfortable but remained silent, their reluctance to engage betraying a deeper fear of confrontation. Barron's jaw tightened. He wasn't someone who sought the spotlight, but there were moments in life when silence felt like complicity. This was one of those moments. His mind raced as he considered what to do. Confronting strangers in a public place wasn't exactly his style, and he knew it would draw attention to himself, attention he had carefully avoided for years. But could he really sit there and say nothing while these people openly insulted a fallen hero? He glanced toward the gate. A small group of uniformed military personnel stood near the entrance, their faces stoic but tinged with sorrow. One of them held the folded flag that would soon drape the coffin. The sight strengthened his resolve. Barron stood up, his tall frame making him instantly noticeable. Heads turned as he walked toward the group of complaining passengers, his steps deliberate but unhurried. He could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him, but he ignored them, focusing instead on the voices that had sparked his action. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but firm, cutting through their conversation like a knife. The group looked up, startled. The man who had been the loudest raised an eyebrow, clearly unamused. "Can we help you?" he asked, his tone sarcastic. "I couldn't help but overhear," Barron replied, his expression unreadable. "You're upset about the delay?" "Yeah, we are," the woman said, crossing her arms. "It's just unnecessary. We all have places to be. Why should everyone else be inconvenienced for this? Barron's gaze didn't waver. Do you understand what's happening here? He asked, his voice carrying a weight that belied his age. That soldier gave their life for this country. For you, for me, for everyone sitting in this terminal. This isn't just a delay. It's an opportunity to honor a sacrifice most of us can't even begin to comprehend. His words hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. The man opened his mouth to retort, but found no words. The woman shifted uncomfortably in her seat, suddenly very interested in her phone. Barron continued, his tone unwavering. I get it. Everyone's in a hurry. Everyone has somewhere to be. But if we can't take a few minutes to show respect to someone who made the ultimate sacrifice, what does that say about us? The terminal had gone completely silent. Travelers stopped what they were doing to watch the exchange, many nodding in agreement with Barron's words. Even the older gentleman in the veteran's cap seemed to relax, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. The complaining group sat frozen, their earlier bravado replaced by an uncomfortable silence. Barron didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked back to his seat, his steps as steady as when he had approached. As he sat down, a murmur of approval rippled through the terminal. Several passengers clapped softly, their applause growing louder until it filled the waiting area. Barron glanced around, slightly embarrassed but deeply gratified. The military personnel began to move toward the gate, the flag-draped coffin carried with solemn precision. This time, there were no complaints, no grumbles, only silence, respect, and a newfound sense of unity among the passengers. Barron sat quietly in his chair for what felt like an eternity, listening to the grumbling voices of the passengers. Each dismissive remark felt like a blow to his sense of decency. He had grown up in a world where respect for those who served the country was non-negotiable, instilled in him by his parents and the countless veterans he had met throughout his life. Today, however, that respect seemed to be missing. As he shifted uncomfortably in his seat, Barron replayed the insults in his mind. Why are we waiting for someone who's already gone? One of them had scoffed earlier. Another had muttered, "It's not like this affects us." The sheer apathy was suffocating. Finally, unable to stay silent any longer, Barron rose to his feet. At 6 feet 7 inches, his height alone commanded attention, but it was his purposeful stride toward the group that caused conversations around the terminal to pause. A quiet murmur spread as passengers noticed the young man approaching the source of the commotion. Barron stopped just a few feet away from the group, his expression calm but resolute. The leader of the group, a man in his mid-40s wearing a business suit, glanced up with a mix of annoyance and confusion. He had no idea who Barron was, but the young man's commanding presence was hard to ignore. "Do you even realize what you're saying?" Barron asked, his voice steady but carrying a weight that made it impossible to dismiss him. The group stared at him, momentarily stunned. The businessman, clearly the most outspoken of the group, recovered first. "And who are you to question us?" he asked, his tone dripping with sarcasm. Barron ignored the challenge. "That soldier gave their life for this country," he said firmly, meeting each of their eyes in turn. "For your freedom, for your safety, for your ability to sit here and complain. They made the ultimate sacrifice and you're upset because you have to wait a few extra minutes." The man scoffed. "Look, kid, I get it. You want to play the hero, but let's be real. Our lives don't stop just because someone else's did." The coldness of the remark drew audible gasps from nearby passengers. Barron's jaw tightened, but he didn't lose his composure. Instead, he took a step closer, his towering frame making the seated man visibly uneasy. "You think your time is more important than a life lost in service to this country?" Barron asked, his voice quieter now but no less intense. "Do you have any idea what that soldier went through? The sacrifices they made? The dreams they left behind? So that you could sit here in peace?" The man shifted uncomfortably, his earlier confidence waning. The woman next to him, who had been nodding in agreement earlier, now looked down at her phone, avoiding Barron's gaze. "If you can't show respect for someone who laid down their life," Barron continued, his voice rising slightly, "then perhaps you need to reconsider what freedom truly means." A heavy silence fell over the terminal. The group of complainers avoided eye contact with Barron, while other passengers began to nod in agreement. An elderly man in a veteran's cap, seated a few rows away, straightened in his chair and gave Barron a subtle nod of approval. Barron didn't stop there. He turned to address the entire waiting area, his voice strong and unwavering. "We take so much for granted," he said. "The safety, the comfort, the freedom we enjoy every day. It didn't come for free. It was paid for with blood, sweat, and sacrifice by people like that fallen soldier. And if we can't spare a few moments to honor them, what does that say about us as a society?" The weight of his words hung in the air. A woman with a child clutched her son's hand tightly, her eyes welling with tears. A young couple exchanged glances, clearly moved. Even the airport staff behind the counter paused in their work to listen. The businessman, now visibly flustered, mumbled something about not meaning any disrespect, but his voice was drowned out by a smattering of applause. It started with a few passengers but quickly grew, spreading through the terminal like a wave. Barron didn't wait for the applause to die down. He turned and walked back to his seat, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't used to speaking out like this, especially in such a public setting, but he knew he had done the right thing. As he sat down, an older woman approached him. Her hair was silver, and her eyes glistened with emotion. "Young man," she said softly, placing a hand on his shoulder, "thank you for saying what needed to be said. My husband was a soldier. He would have been proud to see someone stand up for his brothers and sisters in arms." Barron nodded, humbled by her words. "It was the least I could do," he replied quietly. A few minutes later, the military escort entered the gate area, carrying the flag-draped coffin with solemn precision. The terminal, which had been filled with chatter and complaints just moments ago, now stood in complete silence. Passengers rose to their feet, many placing their hands over their hearts as a sign of respect. The complaining group, now subdued, followed suit, their earlier arrogance replaced by visible shame. Barron watched as the coffin was carefully carried onto the plane, feeling a deep sense of pride and sorrow. He glanced around the terminal one last time. The mood had shifted dramatically, from one of impatience and entitlement to one of unity and reverence. It wasn't about him. It was about what the fallen soldier represented, and in that moment, Barron knew he had done his part to remind everyone of the value of sacrifice and respect. The entire terminal fell silent, the earlier chatter and complaints dissolving into an almost reverent hush. The group of passengers who had been complaining now sat with their heads lowered, their earlier bravado replaced by visible shame. The weight of their words seemed to hang over them like a cloud, and for once, they had nothing to say. At that moment, the gate doors opened, and a line of military personnel entered the area. Dressed in crisp uniforms, their expressions were stoic, yet tinged with sorrow. At the center of their formation was a flag-draped coffin, carried with the utmost care and precision. The sight was both solemn and humbling, a stark reminder of the sacrifice that had been made. A ripple of applause began to spread through the terminal, soft at first, but growing steadily louder. It started with a single passenger, an older woman near the front of the waiting area, who rose to her feet and clapped respectfully. Her gesture was quickly followed by others, and soon, one by one, passengers across the terminal stood to honor the fallen hero. The sound of applause filled the space, echoing off the high ceilings. There were no cheers, no whistles, just a steady, heartfelt acknowledgement of the soldier's sacrifice. Even the airport staff paused in their duties, standing silently with their hands over their hearts. Barron watched from his seat, his heart swelling with a mixture of pride and sorrow. He hadn't sought recognition or attention when he had confronted the disrespectful passengers earlier. In truth, he had hoped to return to his seat unnoticed, but as he glanced around the terminal, he realized the impact of his actions. Across the room, he saw the young mother who had been sitting nervously earlier. She was now standing with her hand over her heart, holding her son close. The boy, no older than 6 or 7, looked up at the coffin with wide eyes, as if trying to understand the significance of the moment. Barron couldn't help but wonder if this experience would shape the boy's understanding of sacrifice and respect as he grew older. The group of complainers, once so vocal, now stood as well, their faces pale and expressions subdued. One of them, a middle-aged man who had been the most vocal, shifted uncomfortably, his earlier arrogance replaced by what seemed to be genuine regret. Barron hoped that this moment would stay with them, reminding them of the importance of gratitude and humility. As the military personnel carried the coffin past the waiting area, the applause softened, replaced by a profound silence. Every eye followed the procession, and many passengers wiped away tears. The sight of the flag-draped coffin was a poignant reminder of the cost of freedom, a cost often borne by those who asked for nothing in return. Barron remained seated, his tall frame slightly hunched as he tried to avoid drawing attention. He wasn't seeking praise. He simply wanted to honor the moment and the soldier whose sacrifice had brought them all together. As the procession moved toward the boarding gate, a veteran seated a few rows away from Barron rose from his chair. He was an older man, his posture slightly stooped with age, and he wore a worn cap adorned with military insignia. He approached Barron with deliberate steps, his eyes shining with emotion. Stopping in front of Barron, the veteran extended his hand. "Young man," he said, his voice thick with gratitude, "you reminded us all what respect looks like." "Thank you." Barron hesitated for a moment before standing to shake the man's hand. "I didn't do anything special," he said humbly. "It was the least I could do." The veteran shook his head. "You did more than you realize. Sometimes all it takes is one voice to remind people of what matters. You were that voice today." Barron nodded, his throat tight with emotion. The veteran placed a hand on his shoulder, squeezing it briefly before returning to his seat. Around him, other passengers began to approach, offering quiet words of thanks or nodding respectfully in his direction. Barron felt a mix of emotions, gratitude, humility, and a profound sense of responsibility. He hadn't expected his words to resonate so deeply, but he was glad they had. As the boarding process resumed, the atmosphere in the terminal remained subdued. Passengers moved with a sense of purpose, their earlier impatience replaced by quiet reflection. Barron noticed a young couple holding hands, their faces solemn as they watched the final members of the military escort board the plane. In the midst of the crowd, Barron spotted the older woman who had started the applause. She caught his eye and offered a small, knowing smile. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Barron returned the smile, feeling a sense of connection to everyone in the terminal. As he boarded the plane, Barron took his seat near the back, hoping to blend in once again. But as the flight attendants moved through the cabin, several of them paused to thank him quietly. One of them, a woman in her early 30s, leaned down and whispered, "My brother is in the military. What you did back there meant a lot. Thank you." Barron nodded, unsure of how to respond. He stared out the window as the plane taxied down the runway, his thoughts swirling. This moment would stay with him for a long time, he realized, not because of the attention it had brought him, but because of the unity it had inspired. For a brief moment, in an ordinary airport terminal, a group of strangers had come together to honor something greater than themselves. As the plane lifted into the sky, Barron closed his eyes, feeling a sense of peace. He hadn't planned to step into the spotlight that day, but he was glad he had. In a world so often divided, it felt good to remind people of the values that truly mattered: respect, gratitude, and the courage to stand up for what's right. And as the plane soared higher, carrying him away from the terminal below, Barron hoped that the memory of that moment, the applause, the unity, the quiet reflection, would linger in the hearts of everyone who had been there. It was a reminder, not just for them, but for him as well, of the power of a single voice to make a difference. If you're inspired by stories that remind us of respect, sacrifice, and standing up for what's right, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Your support helps us share more meaningful stories with the world.